Clara had crossed the ocean with hope in her heart. She was tall, graceful woman with auburn hair that shone like fire in the sunlight, and eyes that carried both gentleness and longing. From the moment she stepped onto the crowded American shore, she believed this new land would give her a chance at love, stability, and a life far away from the whispers that had followed her since childhood. She carried more than just a trunk of clothes. She carried years of dreams, stitched carefully together with hope and determination. But reality was often crueler than hope could bear. Each time she answered a letter from a man in need of a wife, she poured her heart into her words. She spoke of her ability to cook, sew, and keep a house. She promised loyalty and warmth. The men, at first, seemed pleased. They wrote back with promises of their own: a cabin on the plains, a farm in need of gentle hands, a life where she would be valued. But when she arrived, stepping down from stagecoaches or trains, their smiles faltered. They looked up at her towering frame, their confidence shrank, and within hours she was turned away. "She's too tall," they whispered, as though her height made her less of a woman. It was always the same. Their neighbors would snicker, their friends would make remarks, and suddenly the men who had once seemed so eager would change their minds. Clara was sent back to the agency 10 times. 10 times she packed her trunk, trying to hide her humiliation. 10 times she boarded trains with eyes cast down, swallowing the ache in her chest. Each rejection pressed on her spirit until loneliness seemed like the only constant in her life. She was not weak, nor timid. Clara worked harder than many men, and she held herself with dignity even when her heart was breaking. She could milk cows, bake bread, mend clothes, and manage a household with grace. Yet the world looked past her. Men sought women who would make them appear taller, stronger, and more dominant. Clara's height threatened them, and they did not even try to see beyond it. At night, as she lay awake in rented boarding houses, she wondered if perhaps God had made her wrong, if love was something she would never be allowed to taste. Still, a quiet ember of hope burned inside her. She prayed silently, asking for just one man who would not see her height as a burden but as part of her being. She had crossed an ocean for love, endured humiliation and disappointment, yet she still dreamed of a partner, someone who would not shrink beside her, but stand beside her. She imagined simple joys, sharing supper at a wooden table, laughter by the fireside, walking through fields hand in hand without shame. But dreams, she feared, were easier carried than lived, and sometimes she thought hers might fade before ever being fulfilled. The mail-order bride agency began to treat her as though she were a problem they could not solve. "Clara," they said kindly but firmly, "perhaps you should consider returning east. We've tried." "You've tried. The men here want a wife they can look down on, not one they must look up to." She nodded politely, but in her heart she resisted. She had come too far to turn back. Somewhere in this vast country, she believed there must be a man who would not fear her shadow. She only needed to find him. No matter how long it took, her search carried her westward, into the wide open lands of Montana, where forests stretched high as church spires and mountains carved the horizon into jagged beauty. Clara stood on a wooden platform at the train station, clutching her carpetbag once again. Rejected once more, she told herself she would not cry, but her throat tightened as the crowd dispersed, leaving her standing alone. Her gaze dropped to her worn boots, but before she could sink fully into despair, she heard a sound unlike the risa, a deep, rumbling laugh that seemed to vibrate through the air. The laugh was not cruel. It was warm, steady, and somehow comforting, like the roll of thunder that promises rain to dry fields. Clara lifted her eyes and saw him leaning against the station post. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a flannel shirt dusted with sawdust, his trousers stained with honest labor. His beard framed a face weathered by the outdoors, and his eyes were sharp blue, glinting with curiosity. He was taller than her, perhaps for the first time in her life, and his presence seemed to fill the station yard without effort. He was watching her, not with mockery, but interest. "You planning to stand there until the next train comes?" he asked in a low, calm voice, "or are you waiting on a man who just ran out of here like his boots were on fire?" Clara blinked, startled. She had not expected anyone to speak to her, let alone in such a tone, half amused, half kind. "You saw?" she murmured, her voice softer than she intended. "Hard to miss," the man replied with a chuckle. Fellow looked at you like he'd seen a bear. Shame too. Name's Samuel Carver. Some folks call me the Lumberjack. He tipped his hat. Clara drew her shoulders back, uncertain whether to brace for insult or kindness. And are you about to tell me I'm too tall as well, Mr. Carver? She asked, her words edged with weariness. Samuel's lips curled into a slow grin, the kind that came easily from a man who knew his strength. Ma'am, he said, if you're too tall, then I reckon I'm too broad. Looks to me like we'd make a fine pair of misfits. His tone carried no judgment, no hesitation, only a kind of humor that softened her guarded heart. For the first time in months, Clara smiled. They walked together from the station, her carpet-bag swinging gently at her side. Samuel spoke little, but when he did, it was with ease. He asked about her travels, about the places she had seen, and listened to her answers as though every word mattered. The silence between his questions was not uncomfortable, it was steady, like the rhythm of an axe meeting wood. Clara found herself studying his hands, calloused and strong, and imagining what kind of life they built. She wondered if this was the man she had been waiting for, the one who would not flinch at her presence. As they reached the edge of town, Samuel gestured toward the long dirt road that wound into the forest. My cabin's up that way, he said. Not much to look at, but it's mine. Been building it piece by piece between timber work. Hard life, but honest. Clara nodded, touched by the humility in his voice. She had met men who bragged of riches they didn't have, who promised comforts they could not give. Samuel spoke plainly, as if offering her the truth without polish. And strangely, it was this truth that made her feel safer than she had in years. The mountains rose behind them, their peaks catching the glow of the sinking sun. Clara inhaled deeply, the scent of pine and earth filling her lungs. She thought of the many times she had left towns with only rejection at her back. But this walk felt different. Samuel did not glance at her height, nor did he lower his voice with embarrassment when people stared. He walked beside her with a quiet confidence, as though her presence made perfect sense. And as they moved further from town, Clara felt something unfamiliar stirring inside her, hope, not fragile this time, but strong. For Samuel, meeting Clara had been no accident. He had heard stories whispered in the lumber camps of a tall woman from overseas, a bride passed from man to man like a parcel nobody wanted. The men laughed at the tale, but Samuel had been curious. He thought of the trees he worked among, tall and strong, reaching toward the sky without apology. If God made trees to stand tall, why should a woman be judged for the same? Seeing her at the station, standing proud despite rejection, confirmed what he already suspected. She was not a burden, but a blessing. Clara could not yet know what would come of this meeting, but something about Samuel's presence eased the ache she carried. The sting of 10 rejections did not vanish in an instant, but with each step beside him, it dulled, replaced by a sense of belonging she had never known. Perhaps, at last, fate had led her to the place she was meant to be. The sun dipped low, painting the forest in gold, and Clara whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that love might still be hers to claim. Samuel wasn't like other men, where others measured worth by appearances. He looked deeper, to the qualities that endured when looks faded. He was broad-shouldered, with arms hardened by years of splitting timber, yet his strength was matched by patience and honesty. In Clara, he saw not just a woman, but a kindred spirit, someone who had weathered storms and still stood tall. When others had turned her away, he felt only admiration. Her height didn't diminish her beauty, it magnified her presence. To him, she was as striking and natural as the forests he loved. When Samuel first saw Clara, standing taller than most men in the village, he didn't see a flaw, he saw a partner. The way she carried herself, with dignity despite rejection, told him everything about her resilience. He respected that. Her laughter, unguarded and bright, rang out like music in the quiet woods, and it stirred something in him that years of solitude had left untouched. She reminded him of the towering pines, unyielding, proud, and deeply rooted. For Samuel, there was no hesitation. He wanted to know her. Clara, cautious at first, watched Samuel with searching eyes. Years of rejection had carved doubts into her heart, but his words carried no trace of mockery. Your height doesn't scare me, he told her, his smile easy and true. It inspires me. She had never heard such words before. Most men spoke in excuses, not admiration. In Samuel's steady gaze, she felt a sincerity that quieted her fears. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly seen, not as a curiosity or burden, but as a woman worthy of respect and love. As days turned into weeks, Clara began to discover the man beneath the broad frame and Lumberjack's reputation. Samuel's strength was matched by gentleness. He could swing an axe with force, then cradle a bird with care. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried weight. He worked tirelessly, not for wealth or pride, but for the life he was building in the woods. He had no need to impress her with empty promises. His actions spoke instead. For Clara, this was a kind of honesty she had longed for all her life. Together, they built routines that stitched their lives into one fabric. Clara cooked meals while Samuel hauled water from the creek, and in the evenings they shared stories by firelight. She told him of her homeland across the ocean, of the nights she cried alone after being turned away. He listened without judgment, only nodding as though he understood every ache she described. In return, he told her of the forests, how the trees whispered secrets if you listened closely, how the land demanded respect, and how every swing of his axe was both toil and prayer. Neighbors noticed the change in Clara. Where once she walked through town with lowered eyes, now she carried herself with quiet confidence. The whispers that had followed her too tall, unwanted, odd seemed to fade as people saw her hand entwined with Samuel's. He never shied away from her height, never tried to make her smaller. If anything, he made her feel taller, not in body, but in spirit. She realized love was not about fitting into someone else's mold. It was about finding the person who cherished you as you were. Samuel was that person. Life in the woods was not easy, but it was honest. Clara rose before dawn to knead bread and stoke the fire, while Samuel prepared tools for the day's work. She learned to mend not only clothes, but equipment, her hands growing more capable with each passing week. Samuel, in turn, found joy in teaching her about the land, how to read the sky for weather, how to spot deer tracks in the snow, how to listen to the hush of the forest for signs of danger. Together, they became more than husband and wife. They became partners. The seasons passed, each one weaving new memories into their shared life. In spring, Clara planted a small garden behind the cabin, her hands buried in soil as Samuel built a fence to keep out deer. In summer, they picnicked near the river, her laughter mingling with the sound of rushing water. In autumn, they worked side by side to gather firewood, their sweat mingling with the scent of pine. And in winter, when snow draped the forest in silence, they huddled together by the fire, sharing warmth and stories as the wind howled outside. Clara often marveled at the way Samuel looked at her. Even after long days of back-breaking work, he would glance at her as though she were the finest thing he had ever seen. He never made her feel too much or too tall, too loud, too different. Instead, he made her feel exactly enough. She realized that love was not about shrinking yourself to fit into another's shadow, but about standing proudly beside someone who celebrated your light. And Samuel did just that. In his eyes, she wasn't just acceptably, she was extraordinary. In time, others began to see Clara differently too. At church gatherings, women who once whispered now sought her out for conversation, admiring her resilience and kindness. Men who once dismissed her now nodded respectfully when Samuel wrapped an arm around her shoulders. It wasn't that the world had changed, it was that Clara had. With Samuel at her side, she no longer carried the burden of shame. She stood tall without apology, and people responded to the strength in her presence. What once seemed a flaw became a mark of quiet power. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Clara and Samuel stood outside their cabin, watching the sky turn gold and crimson. The air smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. Samuel reached for her hand, his palm rough yet steady. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" he asked softly. Clara turned to him, her heart catching. "What do you see?" she whispered. He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "I see home," he said simply. In that moment, Clara felt tears blur her vision, a knot of sorrow, but of overwhelming joy. Together, they carved a life not built on shallow judgments, but on shared strength and trust. Clara no longer feared rejection, she no longer doubted her worth. With Samuel, She had found a love that lifted her higher instead of pulling her down. She was no longer the woman shuffled from man to man, branded too tall for love. She was Samuel's partner, equal in spirit and heart. And in his eyes, she was more than just right, as she was the answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was making all along. The world outside might still measure people by inches, appearances, or gossip, but inside the forest clearing where their cabin stood, Clara and Samuel measured life differently. They measured it in laughter shared over simple meals, in the strength of hands clasped tightly together, in the peace that came from knowing they had found each other against all odds. Their love grew like the tall trees surrounding Thama, deeply rooted, stretching upward, resilient through storms. And as Clara watched the seasons turn beside Samuel, she knew without doubt, she was never too tall. She was perfect, just as she was.